You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 474 of the podcast. And in this one, I chat with Catherine Goldhouse. Catherine is a licensed independent clinical social worker who specialises in anxiety, OCD, and relationships. And in this, we discuss Catherine's OCD story, inference-based CBT, exposure and response prevention therapy, reality sensing, the idea that I-CBT cares about the why, this concept of the feared self, understanding the concept of inferential confusion, the question of whether you can combine ERP and I-CBT, and much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. So thank you to Catherine for her time. I deeply appreciate it. It was a real pleasure chatting with her. And of course, thank you to you guys for listening. As always, it means a lot. Without further ado, here is Catherine. Welcome to the podcast, Kate.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. So we're going to talk about I-CBT today. But before that, it'll be good to hear your therapy story, like what got you into being a therapist and then ultimately working with OCD.
Yeah. So I've always kind of just been interested in people and why they are the way they are. And I had a close friend who was a therapist, and she worked pretty exclusively with folks with OCD. And I just thought the work that she did was so interesting. And the more that I talked to her, the more I realized that I myself as a kid had OCD growing up. I had kind of a traumatic experience where I was exposed to poison, and I ended up in the hospital. And then after that, I was just worried all the time. What if I touched something that touched that poison? And it was pretty debilitating. At the time, I kept a lot of it secret, but I was mostly kind of dismissed as just being a really anxious kid. But it was a tremendous amount of suffering. And so I think my heart naturally really went out to people with OCD. And I became particularly interested in folks with this sort of more pure O presentation, kind of, about identity or sexuality or harm. That just was really interesting to me, because I think even though my OCD wasn't based on a taboo theme, there was a lot that I kept inside. And I think I just developed a tremendous amount of sympathy for people who have so much shame around their theme. And so I kind of naturally gravitated towards trying to help those folks.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So, how long have you been sort of working with I-CBT as a therapy? And I guess before that, were you primarily doing ERP, and do you still kind of use that as well alongside?
Yeah. So I was one of the, I would say there's maybe 5 or 6 of us in the States who were kind of the original, the pioneers, if you will, to get on board with I-CBT. And so it's been several years now. I was doing ERP. I still do ERP, although predominantly the people who seek me out for I-CBT at this point. So I do much, much more I-CBT than ERP. And so I was doing lots of trainings for ERP, and I was very aware that, ERP, while it's really effective, it's not effective for everybody. And, and people will push back on that and say, well, maybe it's because the therapist isn't doing it right. But I mean, like no medication is effective for every single person, and we can't expect a therapy to be effective for every single person. Sure. But more importantly, there are a lot of people who are afraid of ERP, right? Who are really enduring a lot of suffering, and they're just like, I can't, I don't want to expose myself. And so I would think a lot about like, well, what do we do with those people? And I think the conversation would just sort of stop there. It's like, well, you have to be ready. You have to be ready to do ERP or you're not ready to get better. And it felt really dismissive. So, because just because you're not ready for a particular type of therapy, it doesn't mean you're not ready and desperate and eager to get better. So I was doing lots of trainings in ERP, and I actually had this experience that was pretty significant for me where I was kind of a new therapist and newish. And I had this young woman who I was seeing who had pedophilia OCD, and she was so ashamed and she was just crying the entire sessions. And she was in a tremendous amount of pain. And at the time I had paid to be part of a consultation group with kind of a hotshot therapist who had tons of experience and was advocating this. I signed up for an ERP Act type supervisor. That's what I was seeking out. And in general, this person was really helpful, and I'm still grateful that I was, I got their consultation. But I brought up this client and said, I can't just tell this poor woman, like, maybe you're a pedophile, maybe you're not. You just can know nothing for sure, and you just have to, accept that uncertainty. I said, I can't say that to her. That's gonna, just knowing how much she was crying and how much pain she was in. And the therapist I was consulting with said, well, you have to do that. I mean, she has to learn to accept uncertainty. And she has to be willing to, not push back against those thoughts. And I was like, really? Do I really have to do that? And this therapist really said, yeah, you do. And then she said, not everyone is meant to be an OCD therapist. And so I kind of, that my pride was a bit stung by that. And so I said, okay, well, if I want to be an OCD therapist, I want to help people with OCD. So I'm going to have to do this. And so I went to the next session and I said pretty much verbatim what I was encouraged to say. And my client just like completely melted down. It was awful for her. And even telling that story, it's hard for me because she was in so much pain. And I know not everyone's OCD presents that way. Not everyone is this client. For some people, for a lot of people, ERP is tremendously effective. But for some people, it causes a lot of pain. And so about a year after that, I would say, is when I started learning about I-CBT. And I-CBT takes this very different stance on uncertainty, which is that you have everything OCD is about having everything you need to be certain, but you continue to doubt anyway. And so if you're not sexually attracted to children, if you have no desire to engage sexually with children, if you are not seeking out child pornography, if the whole idea is really off-putting for you, you have all the information you need to know that you're not a pedophile. And so to encourage someone then to sit with the uncertainty that they can never really know for sure, from the I-CBT lens, that just doesn't make sense. And it just resonated a lot with me. Um, and it was just a therapy I felt a lot more comfortable doing with folks with, pedophilia, OCD, harm OCD, um, sexual orientation, relationship OCD, kind of these more pure O type
Mm.
presentations rather than contamination. And it's been really helpful for people. It's what I love about it is that it's a gentler therapy, right? The goal is not to induce anxiety. Um, so it's gentler, but it's really, really effective. And so there's a lot of people who seek me out who they'll either it's one of two things. I tried ERP, it was horrible, I couldn't do it. Can you help me? Or it's I I've learned about ERP, I don't want to try it, I'm too afraid. Can you help me with this other
Mm.
um, type of therapy? And for those folks, I'll explain what I-CBT is, what ERP is. I'll talk about the research behind both, but ultimately let them decide. But the vast majority of people who seek me out have kind of already made up their mind that
Mm.
they want I-CBT.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And I think, I guess what comes to my mind there, and just to anyone with say contamination OC listening, I-CBT obviously would still work with that theme. You're more just saying your preferences, you work more with Pure O as a, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, initially I-CBT was created for this type of OCD, kind of this more pure O
Mm.
thematic stuff. But then through research, they found, oh, it's just as effective for people with contamination OCD. But I guess helping people with contamination OCD doesn't, using ERP doesn't like quite pull at my heartstrings the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, so I just generally, most of the people who seek me out have these more identity or harm related
Yeah.
themes. And I think just I-CBT is just so great for them. But yes, you're right. For contamination, it definitely is, has been found to be just as effective.
Yeah, thank you. And I think where you said, for example, in ERP, it's like we've got to learn to live with uncertainty. We can never know for sure. So I guess is this too much of black and white thinking? But could we say with I-CBT, well, we can know for sure, which is where the reality sensing comes in, and I can't smell a fire, I can't see a fire, I can't hear a fire or a fire alarm. Therefore, I know for sure there isn't a fire. Is it, or wouldn't we go? We wouldn't,
Yeah.
or would we not go that sort of black and white? And we just,
No,
yeah.
no, I think we would. Like if we think about the way that we live our lives, like, do I know that the ground beneath me could fall out? I mean, sure,
Mm.
it's a possibility, right? But I don't live my life that way. I don't live my life walking around like accepting the uncertainty that the ground beneath me is going to fall out.
Mm.
I trust. I choose trust, right? I choose certainty. The way I explain it is like I sort of round up, right?
Okay.
And so while there is this understanding that, like, yes, we could all be in a simulation and nothing is real, and um, in general, we don't choose to live our lives that way.
Mm.
We choose trust and we choose certainty.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of explaining it. Yeah, because there's always the possibility that the floor could collapse from underneath you. It could be a sinkhole, whatever. But statistically, it's near on impossible. Not impossible, but near on that. So yeah, you lean on trust of it's so small the odds that it's ridiculous to even consider it, and that's where.
But it's not even like an odds thing.
Yeah.
It's more like how do you approach everything else?
Hmm.
Like I have a client who worries that um, perhaps um, he harmed someone and forgot about it or is in denial.
Hmm.
And I'll always go back to, well, do you worry about having robbed a bank? And I'll say no. And I'll say, but you can't know that for sure. And he's like, well, yeah, I mean, but if I robbed a bank, like I'd have all this evidence, I'd have more money in my account, or I've had a gun, I might have certain memories. I have, there would be all this evidence. And the lack of evidence is enough for him to have certainty that he didn't rob a bank. And so it's like, why aren't you applying that thinking to this other area? Why isn't a lack of evidence enough for you in this situation? And so it's sort of about using, it's called selectivity of the doubt, right? With OCD, you use very specific, your standards are like quite a bit lower, right, than they are for everything else. For everything else, like you need evidence that something happened in order to take it seriously, or that it will happen. You need something tangible. And yet when it comes to your OCD theme, just the fact that it's possible is sufficient. And so part of the work is pointing out to people like, wait, you're using different standards here. Do you realize that? Like that shows you that OCD is involved, that a story is at play here.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. And, let's say I'm worried about being a serial killer. Let's say that's one of my, harm worries. Why would it be hard for me to, well, why can't I use at this time, let's say logic, it's not one of my themes, by the way, but why can't I use logic here, but I use it everywhere else in my life? Not logic, sorry, like on my senses, the evidence around me. Why is it hard for me, say around this idea of being a serial killer, but if I can cross the road, if I don't see a car, I'm not anxious, whatever it is.
Right. Or you're not worried that you robbed a bank, or that you'll
exactly.
Jump off a building or what have you. Yeah. And so, that's another key difference between ERP and I-CBT is with ERP, it's sort of like, well, the why doesn't necessarily matter so much. It's all intrusive thoughts. It's sort of all arbitrary. And I-CBT says, no, the why is really, really important. The why means that there's a certain area of vulnerability in the way that you conceive of yourself. So somehow along the way, you got the message that maybe I could be a dangerous person, or maybe I'm someone who doesn't have control of himself, or maybe I'm someone who deceives other people. Somewhere along the way, this feared self, a concept, a way that you view yourself that's very inaccurate, but feels very potent and real, developed. And so it sort of all stems from the feared self, this concept that you have of yourself. And then stories develop kind of around that concept. And so part of the work is looking at, well, what are the stories that you're creating that's kind of perpetuating the way that you're viewing things? And then what is this feared self, and where did that come from? How did you land at this idea that you could even be a violent person in the first place? So the why is really important.
Yeah, I like that. And so with the feared self, are you going into, say, people's histories and being like, well, is there something my parents said to me, or maybe I was violent as a kid once and someone labeled me as that and now it sticks in my brain and I dread being that again? Or is it along those lines?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Like for me, when I was a kid and I was exposed to this poisonous plant, and that I was in a pool and I may have swallowed it, I may not have, we don't really know for sure. And that kind of set in motion this idea that I'm susceptible. I'm uniquely susceptible. And so after that, anytime I learned about any sort of disease or any sort of new poison or toxic plant or whatever, in my mind, I inevitably had ingested it, right? And it's because I had created this concept of myself as uniquely susceptible, uniquely vulnerable. And so you sort of look at your history and the dots that you've connected in your life about who you are, and the dots that you've connected kind of making sense of your life. And how have those dots connected to lead to this sort of conclusion? And is there another way to look at that? Was that really an accurate conclusion to come to in the first place? Have you been creating these stories that are actually built off of a misunderstanding or off of something that's completely inaccurate or that's not really relevant anymore?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. I think, what comes to my mind with this idea of the feared self is it's kind of what like psychoanalysts and psychodynamic psychotherapists have been trying to do for a long time, but then they've missed either the IBT or I-CBT approach or the behavioral approach, which is why no change ever occurred for them, because they were just analyzing without any change occurring or change in thinking. So it's interesting to hear that I-CBT is kind of using that kind of let's go back, and it is maybe not always, but sometimes linked to the past or some belief that formed or that's when I do ERP or ACT. I think in that way too of, no, let's think, why are you worried about this? What? And sometimes I can't identify anything, but sometimes I can, and it's really clear. And as you say, it then gives them a story of, I get why my brain is freaking out about this. And I think that can help them see it's not necessarily about the thing the brain's telling them. It's, I don't know, their way of coping or... Yeah. The other idea is Cheryl Paul, I think, says this, but intrusive thoughts are kind of metaphorical or symbolic for something else. And that again, kind of, some intrusive thoughts, they're just signaling back to this feared self.
Right. Yeah, and there really is this kind of huge symbolic component of I-CBT. One of the things that I had growing up is sort of this, like whenever I went to the store, I would always pick out, and I had to pick out something, I'd pick out the thing in the box that was dented, or I would never pick the first object, I'd pick the second or third. And if I did something to one side of my body, I had to do it to the other side. And you'd think, well, is that just right OCD? Do you just kind of stop at like you have to sit with the discomfort? And when I really looked back at, well, what's that all about? It's because it was really drilled into me that you can't leave people out. You have to be considerate of other people, especially people who are vulnerable, especially people who are kind of discarded and unwanted. And so in my little kid brain, I was like, oh, I can't pick the perfect box, right? Everyone else is going to pick the perfect box. I have to pick the dented box, right? And you can see how it didn't come from nothing. And so having me just sort of sit with the discomfort of picking the perfect box or the first box doesn't really get to that, what we call inferential confusion, that kind of confused reasoning behind why I'm doing that, right? Like that there was a lesson that I learned, that I internalized, that I absorbed, that I then misapplied. And so that's one of the things I really like about I-CBT is that it kind of encourages you to keep digging until you find, wait, what was the original lesson here that you took in, and are you applying it correctly? Like, do you think boxes really have feelings and care if you like don't pick them first or not? Where is what was the cause, and then how is it actually manifesting, and does any of that really make sense to you?
That's fascinating. And I think with the boxes, if you don't know the why, and maybe you're saying an ERP approach, and the exposure is, well, you're going to pick the box that get entangled here, that you don't want to pick.
The perfect box. The
perfect box. Sorry, yeah, thank you. The first box, the perfect box. That's the exposure. But if it is symbolic, and what you're really doing is you're not picking someone, or you're letting someone down or hurting their feelings, that makes the exposure makes sense of why it's so scary. It's no longer so irrational. It's linked to your values of you want to be a caring person, or you've been told to be a caring person. Where am I going with this? But I think if you know the story or the why of, I get why this is so hard for me right now, even while I do this exposure, because it's actually, I'm not picking someone less fortunate than myself, or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. And so
Makes
finding
sense.
those just finding that type of inferential confusion is really helpful, because then you're not, something else I appreciate about I-CBT is in ERP and ACT, flexibility is held up as a really good value to have. Right. And I think most people would agree with that. Like, it's good to be flexible. And yet it still is just a value that, is not necessarily any better or worse than any other value. And so a lot of folks with who have OCD also are autistic, and there can be kind of a rigidity to being autistic. And so one of the things that I like about I-CBT is it doesn't kind of encourage someone who may not be being flexible, may not be just part of who they are, and that's okay. And helping them kind of discern, is this a value of yours, or are you kind of creating stories and that's the source of your rigidity? So, like, for example, let's say there's somebody who really cares about the environment and he wants to throw all of his glasses and cans in the right recycling box. He doesn't want to mess up. Now we could say, well, he should learn to be more flexible, and maybe we should have him throw the wrong, a metal can into the glass bin or whatever. But that goes against his values, right? Like, we might think he should lighten up a little, but that's us imposing our values onto him. When it becomes problematic is if he feels that he has to keep checking and making sure he put the right item in the right bin. And if he has to keep going back, then it's moved into OCD territory, because he's no longer trusting the senses. And so while we as therapists might personally be like, buddy, your life would be a lot easier if you could lighten up about this, it's his call. But where we can come in and say, no, actually, you're distrusting your senses. If you want to do that perfectly, that's fine. You do you. But let's make sure that you at least trust yourself to do it correctly, that you're not having to do it over and over and over and distrusting yourself. And what if I forgot? And what if I messed up?
Yeah, really good point. Really good point. And, so you mentioned inferential confusion. And no matter how many, this is probably my 4th podcast now on I-CBT, I think, maybe 5th. I'm still confused about inference and inferentialness, because inference, at least in my upbringing and life, is not a word I've ever really come across. And I assume that's the case for others. So I guess maybe in real simple terms for me, and then if anyone else doesn't understand it, for them too. But, what do we mean when we say inference? What's more easily understood words that I would use? Maybe just start there, actually.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad you asked this. So, an inference is essentially an educated guess, right? It's when we don't have all of the information, but we have enough to put things together. So, for example, if we see 2 people fighting off in the distance, or we see 2 people and they're waving their hands around and they're screaming at each other, even if we can't hear their words, we can infer that they're fighting, right? Or if we look out the window and the sky is blue and everyone is in shorts and tank tops, even if we don't have a thermometer, we can infer reasonably that it's warm outside, right? So it's in my classes, in the classes I teach to clinicians, I say using your CEO, your common sense, your existing knowledge, and your observation. So using your CEO, you can come to a reasonable conclusion about these things. And so we make inferences all day long, right? It's kind of just part of being human. It's, we connect dots. And where OCD comes in is it kind of, I like to think of it as in terms of glasses. So in my class, I give this example where I have a photo of my dog, who's this cute little dog, and she's in a shopping cart on top of a bunch of pillows. And there are paint samples on the wall behind her. And I asked the students, okay, look at this picture and tell me what's going on. And everyone comes to the same inferences. Well, it looks like this dog is in a Home Depot or some kind of like home supply store. Okay, how do you know that? Well, there's paint chips and it's a shopping cart. Okay, and what can you infer about the dog? Well, the dog looks relaxed. The dog's not jumping out. Well, what can you infer about the owner? You don't even see the owner. Well, clearly the owner likes their dog. Like they're putting their dog they brought the dog into the store, it's in the shopping cart. So everyone comes to the same conclusions, right? They infer the same thing. And so then I say, what would you think if someone inferred, what if this dog has rabies? Okay, well, then we've stepped into an unreasonable inference, right? An unreasonable doubt. Because using our CEO, our common sense, existing knowledge and observation, this seems like a pretty relaxed dog. The owner trusts the dog. It's kind of a tame situation. Coming to a conclusion or having a doubt, like, what if this dog has rabies? Obviously, something else is being infused into this situation in terms of someone's perspective, either like a story or some kind of like preconceived notion or a fear that they're adding on. It's like they're putting on certain glasses that are predisposing them to come to certain conclusions. And that's why they come to confused inferences, because they're seeing things through the lens of a certain story. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So you said educated guess, right, for inference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can get on board with that. That makes much more sense. They probably should have just called it educated guess-based therapy. That might have not as catchy, but more easily understood. So with the whole, so with the dog picture, everyone was pretty much getting it spot on. And then, you give the kind of rabies example. The dog isn't foaming at the mouth. It's not, I'm not sure what the other cues of rabies are, but it's not looking mean or agitated or, no one else is scared in the picture or there's no chaos. They are inferentially confused. And the word that comes to my mind is, as you said, something else is going on here. And the word that came to my mind is like they're projecting onto this picture. If they see the dog has rabies, they're maybe projecting this feared self, the beliefs, the core beliefs, whatever it is then being pushed. So in OCD, maybe that's where the feared self or our beliefs or whatever is being pushed into a situation, and that's where the confusion's coming.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So let's say that I am, so I'm a happily married straight woman, right? And let's say I see a woman who I think is just absolutely gorgeous, and certain thoughts may come into my mind. I'm pretty confident in my sexuality, and so there's nothing you could really throw my way that's going to make me question that, right? But let's say I have OCD and I have all kinds of, it's kind of manifested in terms of what if I'm a different sexuality than I thought? And that exact same thing happens to me. I get the exact same type of images, even if I'm in the exact same type of situation. Well, I'm going to react very differently, right? I'm going to be like, oh my God, this is evidence. Like, clearly I'm not in love with my husband as I thought I was. And it kind of sets off this of chain of events, of conclusions that you come to. And so, like you said, if there's a feared self of, I'm unknown to myself, I'm a mystery to myself, and a certain image seems to kind of confirm that, then I'm going to really lose it and get really inferentially confused. Whereas if I had that exact same image, but it didn't touch on my feared self, it would just, it would not affect me at all.
Yeah, nice. And then that this idea of OCD thoughts, we always say OCD thoughts are sticky, right? And they stick around. That would make sense of why when they do stick around, it's tapping into that deeper aspect.
Yeah, and what sticks isn't random, right? What sticks is, for Velcro to stick, like there has to be two parts that stick together, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's kind of a pre-existing vulnerability that makes a certain thought. It doesn't come from nowhere, right? There's already a vulnerability that makes that thought charged as opposed to any other thought.
Yeah. And I feel myself needing to caveat again. I think if anyone listening with real taboo type themes, again, you're not saying, and I'm not saying, if you have POCD, it's not random because you want it. It's symbolic. It's linking to something else in your past. So it's irrelevant in the sense of the very, very surface level. The content is still irrelevant, but the actual thought isn't irrelevant. It's pointing to something deeper that still doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just...
Exactly. Yeah. So to use a different example, let's say I'm afraid, what if deep down I'm a really bad person? And I'm chopping vegetables with my family, and I have this image come to my mind of slashing my dad with the vegetable knife. Any other person who is chopping vegetables with their family would have probably the exact same image, but it would mean nothing to them, right? But if I'm already kind of primed to think I'm a bad person, that type of image, instead of it just meaning nothing, because I'm so primed, I'm going to see that as evidence that supports this belief that, oh my God, yeah, see, look at that. That's evidence that I'm a bad person. Yeah. And so if you have this pre-existing belief, like, oh my God, what if I'm a pedophile? What if I'm a dangerous person? Mm-hmm. You're going to see everything through that lens. You're going to see every conclusion is going to fit that narrative that, oh my God, this must mean I'm a pedophile. And so, of course, it's not true, because there are people who have very similar thoughts that never can come to the same conclusion, right? It's only because you have that pre-existing belief that you somehow think, oh my God, yep, there it is. That's evidence. That's all I need, And so, it's certainly not true. It's just because you already believe it to be true that you see everything as evidence that supports it.
Yeah, that's a good point, that we all have all kinds of weird and wacky intrusive thoughts, but for a lot of us, it doesn't stick. We all have sexual taboo intrusive thoughts, but for most people, it doesn't stick. But I think some of us say POCD, they'll be maybe feel they're the only one having those thoughts. And most people in society have had them at least some point, but it just doesn't stick for them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right.
I'm glad you clarified that. Yeah. When I say there's a pre-existing vulnerability, it's not like a pre-existing desire, right? It's a pre-existing belief about the kind of person you could be. Yeah. And so you're going to see everything as supporting evidence of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were clear the first time around. It's just, I know when people are super, super anxious on these themes,
of course.
I want to really drill it home. Then, there'd be no sort of ambiguity. So not that there was any, but you know what I mean? So I'm just looking at my questions, because we've moved about a lot, but in a really good way. Is there any, you have shared some already, but are there any other kind of either success stories you can share of ICBT or just more general stories of how it worked, which I guess is a success story, but yeah.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of some of the questions that my students ask, my clinician students. Um, so I always find the process of figuring out someone's feared self to be really interesting. And sometimes you'll get these people with these seemingly very disparate themes. Like I had one guy who was both afraid, he identified as straight, but he worried that he could be gay. He was in college. And then he also worried that anytime he saw something on the news, some violent story, that he could, become a murderer. And it's like, oh my God, these two things seem so separate, right? You're afraid you're a different sexuality than you thought, and you're afraid you could be a murderer. And so that process of like, what is this guy's feared self? And there's this temptation to say, well, can't someone have multiple feared selves? And you really want to distill it down to the commonality. And so from talking with him, it's like, okay, so we can't say that your fear is that you're a violent person necessarily. I mean, that's part of it. But what does that have to do with being gay, right? Like it just doesn't line up. And so from talking, we realized, oh, your fear is that you are unknown to yourself. Your fear is that you don't know who you really are deep down. And he was like, oh my God, yes, that's exactly it. And so that process of looking at your themes, because a lot of times people will come to us and they have, I have contamination and I have harm and I have this and I have that. And you sort of think, oh gosh, do I have to work on this one at a time? But really looking at, and sometimes it takes a while looking at this common root where all of these things are sprouting from is a really interesting process. So I always love doing that with people and kind of having them see, oh wow, this belief that like I don't know who I really am. It's shown up in all these areas. And I always enjoy that. That's always really special.
Absolutely. And do you have to know the feared self to do ICBT, or can you get to a point where we're not quite sure, but we can move on anyway in the process?
That's a good question. I don't ever move on until I know the feared self. I do think there's kind of two critical things about ICBT that has to happen in order for treatment to sort of progress. The main one is that you have to realize that you're under the influence of a story, right? It's sort of like you're in a movie or you're in a movie theater and you're watching a movie and your heart is racing because the movie's really scary and you're bought in. And I'm asking you to realize that when the credits roll, that you've just been watching a movie and all the sensations and all the responses that you've been having are because you've been bought into this movie. And so I don't want you going down this road of like, well, were the knives really long enough to actually puncture any organs? Don't go there. I just want you to be able to zoom back out and say like, okay, no. I was under a spell. I was buying into this story. So that's like component number one. And that takes some time, but that's probably the most critical component. And then helping people see, well, what's setting me up to watch this particular movie? What's setting me up to be under this spell? And that's the feared self. Okay. And so I think once those two components are kind of, you have a handle on both, then you can really start looking at inferential confusion and reality sensing. And it's just the rest of the treatment makes a lot more sense once there's kind of a cognitive understanding of how those things are at play.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thank you. So, just looking at my questions. So, for the listeners, there's obviously ICBT.online, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are there any other resources, be that books, videos, whatever else, that you would recommend if people want to find out more on ICBT?
Yeah, so I have I started an Instagram account, ICBT Therapist, that I try to update. And for therapists, there is a Facebook group specific to ICBT. And yeah, ICBT.online is a really great resource. There's articles, there's videos. On my website, catherinegoldhouse.com, I have some articles that I've written. And a few of us, like a few of those, early adapters, or early adopters rather, are teaching classes. So there's not a ton out there right now. Fred Artema, who was one of the co-creators of ICBT, just released a new book for people with OCD. So that's pretty exciting. Just, I think in January, just this last month. So
yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you for that. So before I change tracks, is there anything else on ICBT you wanted to share today?
Oh, I guess I should say, so people always ask me, can you combine ERP and ICBT? And my answer to this doesn't reflect a belief that there should be like any animosity between these two therapies. These are both methods of helping people. Like, thank God that we have more than one, right? That's just a good thing. And so, no, I don't think they can be combined. I think you have to do one or the other. It doesn't mean you can't like switch from one and move on to a different one if the first one's not effective, but you can't do them simultaneously. And that's because the goals are fundamentally different, right? The goal with ERP and ACT is about acceptance, distress tolerance, accepting uncertainty. The goal with ICBT is self-trust, returning to reality, and reality sensing. And so those are both really valid places to land, right? Like, we all want to be able to have both of those skills, but they are kind of in contradiction at the same time. So another question that people ask is, one of ICBT's, one of the things that draws people to ICBT is that it doesn't require exposures to get better. But you can do exposures with ICBT. But an ICBT exposure is very different than an ERP, a traditional ERP exposure. So a traditional ERP exposure is about inducing anxiety, getting into the imagination, really kind of riling yourself up. And, depending on the philosophy you come from, realizing that you can have, if you're kind of doing the inhibitory learning approach, realizing you can have a different sort of experience than what you anticipated. It could be realizing that you can handle the discomfort. None of that is part of an ICBT exposure. An ICBT exposure is essentially about not avoiding, going into a situation and staying grounded in reality. That's sort of it. You don't want to trigger anxiety, because if you trigger anxiety, the thinking is you're just going to associate that with kind of an anxiety-inducing situation. And so can you go into the situation that's triggering and stay connected to yourself, stay connected to reality? So exposures aren't a necessary component of ICBT, but they can be done, but the goal is different.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess in ICBT, an exposure is just another way of getting you to practice the skills of ICBT. by putting yourself in
Yeah.
the situation.
Right.
Rather than waiting for it to happen to you.
Right. Yeah, and a big fundamental difference is with ERP, it's a behavioral therapy, right? So you change your behavior and that changes your thinking. With I-CBT, it's reversed. You change your thinking and that changes your behavior. So sometimes I'll see online people will say there's no such thing as healing from OCD without exposures. And it's like, well, I mean, if you're one of these people who views like life as an exposure, I mean, sure, like, okay, then of course, there's no healing there's no doing anything, if life is a requirement, but it's not part of the treatment, right? It's not, whereas exposures are a fundamental part of ERP. Whereas with I-CBT, it's understanding this inferential confusion. It's understanding that you've been under a spell. It's understanding that the role of stories, how they're influencing you, and then going into situations where those are no longer kind of infecting you.
Yeah, nice, good explanation. Awesome. Well, a couple of questions. So, yeah, you pick up. I can't speak. You could pick up the phone and call the 20-year-old you. What do you tell her?
So, because I've listened to many of your episodes, I was like, oh, he's going to ask me this. I have to have a good answer. And I think it would be to be open. I think when you're young, you really, at least for me, there's this urge to find the right path, the one that's the best, the one that's correct, the one that's kind of most well known, and to just stay open and not be blind to other paths. I think we really do ourselves a disservice in kind of in being closed-minded. Yeah,
I agree with that. And you got a billboard where you live? What do you want written on that billboard?
tell the truth and be kind.
Yeah, nice. I like it.
Yeah,
two important things. So, yeah, I guess lastly, anything else you wish you could have said or shared today about anything?
I guess when it comes to reality sensing, I mean, I kind of touched on this, but sometimes people will say, well, reality sensing, what if it doesn't have to do with your five senses? What if it is stuff like, what is the reality sensing for, like, could I be a murderer or could I be a pedophile? Or they'll say, well, reality, like, I'm having groinal responses. Isn't that paying attention to reality? Isn't that my senses telling me something? And what I would encourage people to think is reality sensing also has to do with, it's your five senses, but it's also like what you think, how you feel, what you want, what you don't like, what you do like. And I know that I love my dog, just like I know I love summertime, and I know I don't like mosquitoes, and I know I don't like humidity. And, there are these things that we know about ourselves. I know when I have to breathe. I know when I have to pee. I know when I'm cold. And so when you step into a place of like, well, do I want to engage sexually with a child? Don't look to things like groinal responses for your answer. Look to yourself, just like, if you love your dog or not. If the idea of watching child pornography is abhorrent to you, you know that. And, with OCD, then it, but then you start questioning after and
Okay,
bringing in all these other things to make you second guess. But use those same standards that you would for knowing if you like chocolate or if you like summertime, that you would for anything else. The other thing is with groinal responses, that's not evidence that's not reality sensing, right? Anytime you come into a situation with a pre-existing story, anything you find thereafter is essentially planted evidence. So it doesn't count. So if, like when I bought a new car, all of a sudden, everyone had my kind of car on the road. What do you know? Like, isn't that crazy? No, it's because like I was paying attention to that particular type of car. Right. And so if you go into a situation already kind of in a certain frame of mind or already scanning to see if you get a certain result, it's a wash because you are not looking for organic. You're not looking at evidence organically. So I will always ask people when they say, well, but I get groinal responses. I'll say, do you get them organically or do you scan for them and then you notice them? And it's always, oh no, yeah, I scan for them first and then I notice them. And so just that's one thing that I would really want to be clear on is that anything you find from scanning, that's not reality sensing. That's just planted evidence. And you have to discount that. Real evidence arises organically without us seeking it out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Well, thank you so much. You definitely furthered my understanding of I-CBT and definitely inferential confusion and doubt. And so thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. And if you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD Stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.